Hi everyone. We are Rebekah and Alon. Obviously, I'm not Rebekah. We are graduates of the Game Design Master Program from Shankar College in Tel Aviv. And this presentation is a short summary of our final paper for that program. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Rebekah will start us off and I'll join later.
Thank you, Alon. We are here to talk about companion NPC design. More specifically, we will cover narrative hierarchy, Ludic Affordances, their evolutions, and the in-game impact. Now, this is quite a mouthful, but hopefully by the end of this talk, each element will be a little bit clearer. Working?
Yeah.
Where is the slide? Sorry. You go with the mouse.
Where's the mouse? Great.
Yeah, okay. We'll start with a short clip from the game we created that stemmed from this research. The game is called Subjects, and it is a side-scroller puzzle platformer. The small-scale game features two mice who work in a laboratory. The two come across new areas in the lab that they weren't aware of prior. They decide to explore the new spaces together while figuring out their way around traps and learning more about the lab's secret work. Okay, now let's see how this game and research came about. So I talk about companions. The choice of this topic, the companion NPC design, stems from our love for games as a delivery method for stories. Part of what sustains a good story are the characters within it. In this case, we wanted to focus on instances with a significant companion character that helps propel the story forward. Therefore, our goal was to examine the structures and dynamics between the companion and player characters and try to define design aspects that could help introduce interesting design models for the future. A quick overview of our main talking points today. First, we'll talk about NPC, specifically a companion NPC. Next, an outline of the CNPC Ludo-Narrative design, from which we will touch specifically on its elements, which are narrative hierarchy and Ludic Affordances. These culminate into the Ludo-Narrative Co-Evolution, which includes correlation and synchronicity. Finally, we will present our own design experiment, Subject, the game you just saw. Now let's start with the basics. NPCs are non-player characters that are basically any character in the game that is not controlled by the player. NPCs come in all shapes and sizes, and some make brief appearances while others stay longer. They can be both game mechanics, like shopkeepers, and narrative instruments like villains. Each of these two sides have various aspects that can be examined. When we examine NPCs as a game mechanic, we can look, for example, at their autonomy. To what extent does this character act based on their own decisions? Alternatively, we can look at capabilities. What can the NPC actually do in the game? On the other hand, if we look at NPCs from a narrative point of view, we can ask, who are these characters? What are their motivations? How do they perceive the player character? And much more. For our research, we chose to focus on a specific subcategory of NPCs, the companion NPC, or CNPC as we refer to it in short in the research and this presentation. Several game researchers gave different definitions of what a companion NPC is. For the purpose of this talk, as we see it, a companion NPC is first of all an NPC that accompanies the player character throughout the majority of the story. Second, from a narrative perspective, it is a character which is crucial to the plot. In fact, the story itself cannot occur in the absence of the CNPC. A good example for this is the character of Ellie from The Last of Us, who serves as a MacGuffin that drives the plot forward. Third, the companion may be present physically next to the hero, like Ellie, or be present only auditorily, like Atlas and BioShock. Finally, our focus was on games that feature a single companion character as our CNPC. Putting together everything we discussed so far, we decided to delve into CNPC design, both from a narrative as well as a mechanical point of view. We examined the interactions between the CNPC and the player in several games and proposed two design aspects. These are the narrative hierarchy and the Ludic Affordances. Now, before we go into each of these design aspects, let's look at some of the previously defined CNPC design aspects that they are based on. Narrative hierarchy is based on the companion's individuality and their relation to the player, meaning what are the companion's personality and agenda, and what is the nature of their relationship with the player character. Ludic Affordances is based on the companion's degree of autonomous behavior. To what extent can the CNPC act on their own accord, as opposed to being directed by the player's commands? Since we focus on the interactions between the dynamics of the CNPC and the player with his character, the definitions of narrative hierarchy and Ludic Affordances were developed to reflect that. Starting with narrative hierarchy, it is defined by the power balance between the two characters. For example, it could be based on family relation they may have, military ranks, a certain agenda, or different personality types like strong-minded versus weak-willed. It is also defined by how strong the bond is between them. Are they close to one another or not? Finally, we look at how the power balance evolves and changes as the story progresses. Relationships between characters can grow stronger, weaker, or remain relatively unchanged. If we look back at one of our previous examples, The Last of Us, then Joel and Ellie start off simply as a smuggler and a package. The power balance puts Joel as the superior in many ways, such as age, strength, and even purpose. He needs to deliver Ellie in order to get something back in return, while Ellie's purpose is to simply follow, although loudly. The bond between them is very weak, seeing as they start off as complete strangers. However, this evolves throughout the game and ends with them becoming much closer. The dynamic between the two develops into a father-daughter-like relationship. Their bond is much stronger, seeing as they grew to care for one another. Another example is 2010's Enslaved: Odyssey to the West. The power balance between the player character, Monkey, and the CNPC Trip is the other way around. Despite Monkey being physically superior, Trip is more tech-savvy and manages to subjugate Monkey with a restraining headband. The headband forces him to do as she says, and the game even refers to her as his captor. Still, during the game, the two grow closer over Trip's hardships. Monkey gains insight and understanding, while she develops compassion towards him in return. The bond becomes that of comrades, with hints of potential romantic attachments. Moving on to Ludic Affordances, it refers to the extent of the player's control over the CNPC. This includes what type of control is afforded to the player over the companion. For example, it could be mechanics that relate to combat, commands that assist in puzzle solving, or simply directing the CNPC's movement. In addition to what type of control, Ludic Affordances also refers to how many possibilities the player has. This can range from non-existent to a high degree of control. And similar to narrative hierarchy, Ludic Affordances may also evolve throughout the game or remain unchanged and static. Now, using The Last of Us as our baseline example again, this is an instance where the player has no control over Ellie, the CNPC. The player as Joel cannot instruct her or direct her in combat. Joel even has to help her get to places in environmental puzzles where Ellie is the puzzle itself, rather than being helpful in solving it. Even when Ellie functions as support, such as shooting at enemies, the player has no control over when or where she shoots. BioShock Infinite is an interesting example of a mix between the player's control over the CNPC and the CNPC's autonomy in interacting with the game world. The level of control is varied. It can be as simple as a choice of which brooch to wear, to instructing for a lock to be picked, or a tear in reality to be open. These so-called tears can grant more possibilities in combat or assist in maneuvering the environment. Regarding the autonomy side, the CNPC reacts to the world around her, independent of the player. She also gathers supplies for the player character, but here, the player must accept the help being offered, which gives a slight measure of control. These different types of control are gained as the game progresses, being able to better utilize the CNPC for combat, traversal, and supplies.
Keep going. So as Rebekah mentioned before, both the game's narrative hierarchy and Ludic Affordances may evolve throughout the game. So the next focus in the research was to inspect points of interaction between those two evolutions. Do they evolve separately from one another, or does one feed into the other? This is what we refer to here as the Ludo-Narrative Co-Evolution. So by looking at several case studies, we identify two additional design aspects to help us better describe this co-evolution. The first one is correlation, which describes whether the two evolve in the same or in opposing directions. The second is synchronicity. It describes to what extent do these points of change are shared between the Ludic Affordances and narrative hierarchy. So what do I mean by correlation? As I said, correlation is determined by the direction in which the narrative hierarchy and Ludic Affordances evolve. If they both evolve in the same direction, we could say this is a positive correlation. And if they evolve in opposing directions, this is a negative correlation. I'll give you a hypothetical example of a negative correlation. Throughout a game, the player character and the CNPC learn to work together, and in turn, the CNPC becomes more independent. As a result of this, the player needs to give less and less commands, meaning his Ludic Affordances actually evolve negatively. This leads to a negative correlation, but a well-justified one. Let's move on to synchronicity. Synchronicity examines the moments in the game in which the narrative hierarchy and Ludic Affordances change. Both may change simultaneously or independently. Synchronicity is defined by whether or not those points are shared, such as a change in narrative that leads to a change in mechanics. For example, the player and the CNPC survive a battle by working together. They get closer, friendlier, and in turn, the player is granted the option to trigger a new type of attack by the CNPC. On the other hand, these points of change can also happen independently. We've seen instances before where players are given additional control over the CNPC with no narrative justification. In this case, where the development in narrative and mechanics is completely separate, we say the co-evolution is asynchronous. Now, don't get me wrong, asynchronicity is not necessarily bad. There are many games that feature UI-based upgrade systems, like those that originated in RPGs. Those systems are by nature non-diegetic and thus asynchronous. Although some moments of asynchronous co-evolution may be slightly jarring to players and might lead to dissonance between gameplay and expectations. So after determining all these design aspects for examining the CNPC player interactions, we examined 7 case studies of existing games according to each design aspect. We found in those examples that for the most part, and not surprisingly, the narrative hierarchy evolves in a positive direction. Characters go closer. On the other hand, Ludic Affordances either evolve in a positive direction or not evolve at all. And when reviewing the Ludo-Narrative Co-Evolution, the observations of correlation were somewhat consistent. There is mostly either no correlation or a positive correlation. In the case studies featured here, there were no instances of a negative correlation, meaning characters get closer, but the player's degree of control decreases, or vice versa. And regarding synchronicity, interestingly, the results were more varied than in other aspects. We did not identify any consistency in co-evolution synchronicity like we did in relation to correlation. So we look at these results and we see some combinations are missing. What about a negative evolution of the narrative hierarchy, where characters go apart? The same can be said for Ludic Affordances. We rarely see instances where the control is taken away from the players. And this leads us back to subjects. Following the results, we decided to develop a game as a design experiment. We determined that the guiding pillar of that game will be positive correlation and a highly synchronous co-evolution. And thus the game subjects was created. During development, the level design and narrative design were a singular process. By that, I mean there are specific points in the game where both the narrative hierarchy and Ludic Affordances change simultaneously. The game was developed with a changing dynamic in mind. To elaborate, in these specific points during the game, the overall tone of conversation and the player's degree of control over the CNPC change to reflect the character's current relationship and mood. However, one scenario that features the more common evolution wasn't going to be enough. Therefore, we decided to create two scenarios, with the second being of a less traditional evolution type. So scenario A features a positive evolution, where from a narrative standpoint, as the game progresses, the bond between the player character and CNPC becomes stronger. Parallel to that, the player gains access to new commands that can be given to the CNPC. Scenario B features something a bit different in the form of a negative evolution. Story-wise, the dynamic and bond between the two characters deteriorates. In this scenario, the player starts the game with all commands available. In order to maintain a positive correlation, as the characters drift apart, the player loses access to those commands. What actually happens in the game is that the CNPC refuses to follow commands he previously agreed to execute. And when players start the game, one of the scenarios is chosen at random, actually not aware of there being two possible scenarios. So to put it into better perspective, the positive scenario A features a positive development in both narrative hierarchy and Ludic Affordances. Both correlate positively in the same direction, and since they occur simultaneously, they are synchronous. The negative scenario, B, which is less common in games, showcases a negative development in both narrative hierarchy and Ludic Affordances. Both still correlate positively, their development being in the same direction, and since they occur simultaneously as well, they are synchronous. Let's look at another clip from Subjects. In this clip, we can see the characters arrive at a new type of trap, one that shoots projectiles. The player character suggests that the bigger mouth, the CNPC, can use the sample slide he's carrying on his back to block the projectiles, and the CNPC agrees. Later on, after some story progression in which the relationship worsened, they come across the same type of trap again. This time, when asked to help, the CNPC outright declines. He's actually not willing to do anything at all except follow. So, to wrap up this talk, when looking at the future of companion CNPC design, we've demonstrated a new perspectives that may be considered. These are, which are the narrative hierarchy and Ludic Affordances, as well as the Ludo-Narratives Co-Evolutions, Correlation and Synchronicity. Next, despite there being no absolute way of designing the dynamic between the player character and the CNPC, there may be unexplored possibilities, such as the use of a negative co-evolution. This can lead to unique forms of players' interaction with the narrative. And finally, we theorize that co-evolution that is both positively correlated and synchronous may assist in players' engagement. We believe that this topic has interesting potential for future work. Thank you.